Welcome to the Dr. Lori Mars podcast, where she interviews experts in health and science, sharing their expertise so you can live your healthiest life.
This episode of the podcast is proudly sponsored by Fit Vegan Coaching, the world's leading whole food, plant-based body recomposition program for Gen X and baby boomers. Founded by Maxime, whose personal journey began after losing his ex-fiancée to breast cancer, Fit Vegan Coaching is on a mission to disease-proof the world through the transformative power of plant-based eating and fitness. This program is the Rolls-Royce of plant-based coaching, offering all-inclusive services, personalized plans, world-class accountability, lifelong support, and more. Say goodbye to the yo-yo dieting and embrace a lasting transformation that will rev up your metabolism even post-transformation. Ready to take charge of your health and vitality? Head over to fitvegan.ca, that's fitvegan.ca, and mention Dr. Lori for exclusive bonus savings when you sign up. Don't miss this opportunity to join the movement towards a healthier, fitter, and more vibrant you. This episode of the podcast is proudly sponsored by The Healing Kitchen, your path to vibrant health. Immerse yourself in the transformative program, guided by the combined expertise of myself, Dr. Lori Marbus, and Chef Brittany Giroudi, who has lost 70 pounds on a whole food plant-based diet. Here's what's in store for you. Virtual weekly sessions. Engage in an immersive 60-minute virtual session every single week, where you'll delve into the world of wholesome plant-based goodness right from your own kitchen. Cooking with Brittany the first half hour. Unleash your inner chef as you're captivated by Chef Brittany Giroudi's culinary mastery that will delight your taste buds and nourish your body. Medical Q&A with Dr. Lori the last half hour. Prioritize your well-being during the second half hour. I will personally address your medical inquiries, providing evidence-based insights and personalized advice, empowering you to make informed choices for your health. So join us on the Healing Kitchen to help you step into a healthier and most vibrant future. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dr. Lori Marbus, and I am so excited to continue this conversation about overcoming food addiction with my very dear friend and expert, Catherine Van Tassell. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
Good. Well, let's get down to the nitty gritty, because the last two podcasts, by the way, if you haven't listened to these, go back and listen to podcast 1 and 2 in this series, all about overcoming food addiction. Catherine really talks about the state of affairs, what food addiction is, what are the causes. But today is what I love talking about is like the how to overcome food addiction, or at least start down that path of journey of, dealing with it. So let's just maybe do a short recap on what food addiction is, how to know if you have it, and then we can kind of jump into the how-tos of overcoming it.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you that weren't here, we were talking about what food addiction can look like. And really, we know that this isn't recognized in the DSM, but it's this new field of emerging science. And we most certainly have recognized that people overconsume food to the point where it's causing distress in their life. And that is the part that I really want people to consider when they're thinking, is this impacting me? Because we all know people that can eat one cookie or one candy bar and then move on and not maybe hyper focus on it, or feel like, oh, I've messed up, and then eat the whole sleeve or the whole box. But if you're somebody that has noticed food impacts my thoughts, whether I'm always thinking about food, what am I going to eat next? Did I eat too much? Just feeling like this, always being consumed by thoughts of food, overeating food to the point where you feel physically ill, maybe having disordered thoughts or behaviors around that. So eating to the point of feeling sick and then saying, I'm never going to eat that food again. And there's a lot of diagnostic criteria. We talked about the Yale score. You can go through that online and go back and listen to that episode. But this will essentially walk you through some of those thoughts and behaviors that you might have if you do struggle with food. The underlying bottom line is, if food is causing distress for you physically or emotionally, or you feel like you have lack of control around food, then that would be something to perk up and pay attention to. and then go through the Yale food addiction score, or the classification. And then we'll today talk about why, or things that you can do for it, because we know that it's multifactorial. This could be partly genetics, partly your environment, partly psychological factors, like think trauma and stress in one's life. So there's not one solution that fits all. Kind of like anything in medicine, this needs to be specialized to you, and to what's happening in your life.
Perfect. So I think it's that really important piece is one, understanding that this can be personalized. And so one, you're noticing that it's causing an issue. You're having these thoughts, kind of obsessive thoughts about foods, or, shame or guilt around consuming foods, or feeling struggling to walk away from foods that you don't want to partake in. And then two, you do a little bit of research and you're like, I think I fit the category of basically food addict, or difficulty struggling with food addiction. So how do we begin, one, maybe with the mindset of knowing that this is going to be a journey, it's not going to happen overnight. Maybe we can set there and just set the tone for realistic outcomes, and how long it's going to take, or if there's another way you feel like we should start.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Maybe thinking about the different treatment modalities. We have therapy, we have medications, and community. I would say those would be the three big buckets. And therapy, that can be psychotherapy, that could be working with a psychiatrist doing medications and therapy. So multiple options within these buckets, because community could look different too. So maybe we could start with talk therapy, because this is one of the most well-researched, and there's multiple options. So think of dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and interpersonal therapy. Those are three that have been researched in this area. And maybe we could talk about CBT, because I think CBT is fun to talk about, and kind of go through what that would look like.
Sure. Am I going to be your guinea pig?
Maybe, yeah. I like that. I don't like it to be just on me.
Let's go for it.
Okay, perfect. So cognitive behavioral therapy, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is essentially, we have what I always tell patients that I work with, stinking thinking. So we have these thoughts that are essentially not true. And we kind of have to be a judge of our thoughts. Like, is this true, or is this my stinking thinking? And challenge those thoughts. I mean, I'm sure everybody that's listening to this could relate to a time where something happened, and then they ruminate on that, and it becomes this bigger and bigger tale in their head, and it causes a lot of anxiety or maladaptive behaviors. So when we identify our thoughts and challenge them, it can be very, very helpful, because our mind tends to play some tricks on us from time to time. So when we're thinking of a thought, what would be a thought, Laurie, around food that you could think of that may be untrue, or a story you're telling yourself that would work against you?
Oh, I can eat a bag of nuts and not have any consequences.
Yeah, yeah, that's great.
Like, I'm talking a pound of nuts, not just a handful.
So this thought that you love nuts, you can eat all of the nuts, and you have no control over it.
Especially pecans.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So Dr. Laurie Marvis has no control over pecans. This is the story you're telling yourself in your brain, okay?
Yep. So much that I put them in the back of the cupboard and only order them at a certain time of year, which is now, because I utilize them in recipes, and I found myself snacking on them. Yes.
Yes. Okay, so let's work on this. Okay, so what would be a trigger that would cause you to overconsume said pecans?
So many. I would say a break in my meetings, right? So it's time to get up and stretch and move. And literally the kitchen is right here. So I I know what's behind that cabinet door, and I could probably tell you how much is left in the bag. And so, it's not even so much quote unquote boredom, because I feel like there's plenty of things that I can do to keep myself mentally engaged, but it's like getting up and movement, trying to do that piece, and I might as well be proactively, looking and doing things while I'm moving around. So I would say a natural break in my day, so snacking pieces, and especially if it's closing in on either the lunch hour or the dinner hour, and I haven't made my meal yet. So it's like a primer to the meal. It's like, oh my
Your
gosh.
appetizer.
And so, or it's, after my meal, I'm like, oh, that's a few nuts. That's my dessert. But 3, 4, or 5 handfuls adds up in a day. So again, and sometimes just to, appease my mind about consuming too many pecans, I'll throw in some pumpkin seeds or walnuts to get my zinc and my ALA.
So you're making it a healthy indulgence.
I'm making it even a more healthy indulgence by consuming more nuts than just my handful of pecans, because you shouldn't decrease the amount of pecans. I'm just adding to it. I'm not restrictive. I'm adding to. So yeah, there you go. Those are the inner workings of my brain at these last few days.
And I think that this is such a good example because, all of us think, oh, pecans are healthy food, right? There's nothing wrong with pecans. But it's anything we can overeat. And that then leads to bad outcomes if we just overeat in times when we're not physiologically hungry, right? So this comes to noticing that and recognizing that trigger. When you said it wasn't boredom, it was this break. It doesn't seem like it's boredom, but it's something to keep you busy.
Yeah.
Or maybe like the next thing you want to do, that's going to take some sustained focus. So
Yeah.
somewhat of a distraction.
Possibly. Yeah. My husband and Jonathan, my son, like to say, Mom, you just like to work. So I love working, like not working, like I like creating, right? So I feel like with my work and seeing patients, I love that interaction. I love reading and learning and saying, okay, how am I going to share this with my audience or my patients, how it's going to benefit them? I'm so excited to share a new message that someone might be able to benefit from. So there's that piece. So yeah, there is definitely a mental fatigue that may come with that. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I can eat this. This will keep my stomach from going, or if I've had a delay in my lunch or something, sometimes that, because like I haven't eaten lunch yet and it's almost 2.
Yeah.
That's a problem as well. So no, yeah, you're exactly right. I can rationalize anyway. And each half of a pecan is 10 calories. So so when I'm going through even like monitoring my caloric intake, it's like, oh, I have room for another 5
10
or 8.
calories. I think that's so this kind of plays into what I was going to say next is keeping a diary or noting when you do this. If it doesn't come easily, like, why am I doing this? But like having this conversation that I'm sure there's like everything's multifactorial, but that fatigue, you are, especially in a creative role or in a helping role, in a helping like service, that takes a lot of energy.
Right.
So you get some energy from those pecans, some enjoyment, like very passive too, because you don't have to put a lot of effort to that.
Well, and I should also share that there's a really strong childhood foundational memory about my enjoyment of pecans. So my my grandmother's parents had a huge pecan tree in their backyard, and they lived 20 minutes from us. And some of my favorite memories are going to their house, picking up the pecans, cracking the pecan, like pecans come in shells, by the way, for those of you who don't know this, that actually pecans are a shelled nut. They come in a shell. And in the natural state, you have to crack the shell and pull it up. And I know many of us are removed from that and don't understand that, but was a huge enjoyment. And then eating these pecans that just came off this tree was such a delight. And then my great grandmother would make the most delicious pecan pie. Oh my gosh, just thinking about it, I'm seriously salivating. And so every time I eat that pecan, there's that little bit of happiness and joy, just reliving those days when I was a kid and would spend time with my great grandparents. And so there's that too.
Okay. See, there's lots of reasons there
Yes.
behind it. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've identified trigger, emotional tie to that, enjoyment that it's brought to us. So then we would move on with challenging that thought, because it's this thought that I can't control myself around these. And is that really true?
I would say on certain days, sure. I think, I try to portray a positive affect when I'm in front of, camera, doing my lives, doing my YouTube, but people don't understand. I get tired, I get stressed as well. I really worked really hard on my inner voice and how I talk and get myself, out of that as quickly as possible. But on those days that I would say that I am more fatigued and really struggle, a stressful event or news or something, again, like for example, when my husband's mom was dying earlier this year and she passed away in April, I would definitely say I would be at a higher risk of, looking for that moment, right? Because one, it's bringing me joy thinking about my great grandparents. I like the crunch, I like the taste, and they're easily accessible. So, and I don't have to think of them as an unhealthful food because they are a healthy food. But at the same time, I shouldn't be eating half a pound in one day. So, that would be absolutely true. Contextually, it can absolutely be a challenge in where I would struggle with resistance. And that's where I don't typically have pecans in the house most of the year.
So you've made a choice, right?
Right.
To change your environment.
Right. Exactly. Even though it's hard.
Even though, so this would be my question to anyone else too, when they're trying to make this change, would be, what is something that you've done in the past that has been hard, but you've still succeeded and made a change in it?
Oh, yeah. Like, you mean like something I shouldn't do or challenge, or just doing things that are hard?
Well, it could be anything, something that you wanted to change, but it was very difficult for you to change a behavior.
Um, Something that was difficult to change. I think, I think self-talk, right? So I think honestly, this inner dialogue and why I've become so fascinated by helping people understand that we can change our inner dialogue and why I get attracted to psychology. So when I was in college, there was a particular course that I really wanted to take was abnormal psychology. I loved psychology. Like I could have easily become a psychiatrist or psychologist because it's health psychologist. If I didn't know about health psychology, I probably wouldn't be talking to you right now as an MD. And so that piece was really an important piece. Where was I going with this? Oh, yes. And looking and thinking about this inner dialogue. So I grew up in a home that didn't encourage a healthy inner dialogue, but I had people in my life that spoke a different language. So was blessed in the sense that I had people who taught me a different language of inner dialogue. And so I think that was really hard for me for a long period of time, probably 4 to 5, 6 years, maybe even well into my early 40s, of allowing destructive self-talk to impede my movement and doing things, right? And the reason that I was able to do harder things was just to say that, tell people I'm worthy of your love or adoration or whatever it is, or acceptance, right? Be it family or friends or whatever, because I've earned it. I've done these hard things besides just being a human, and just in that capacity we should love each other. But I think that inner dialogue and that inner work, mental work, was by far the hardest behavior to change, because it's not something that you expose to someone on a regular basis, but it has such a profound implications on how I respond to the world, how I am there for people. And I think my children were a huge benefit to me in the sense that I needed to model a different behavior and thinking and how I respond to things, and really trying to take time to reflect on things as something happened, Was it my response in how I lack of activity or lack of something, or did I overdo something? And really just trying to see how understanding that how I care and think to myself about myself and all day, every day is so important. And that it's okay that on occasion, yes, I'll, hear things, the mental chatter, but the majority of the conversation in my head needs to be positive because that's how I show up in the world in a better, positive, more manner. And it doesn't make me what's the word I'm looking for, stingy or self self like arrogant, or oh, I'm worth it. This is,
Self-centered.
yeah, self-centered, that's what I'm looking for. This really just takes me to a place of self-care that we should all be able to do and should be doing. And I'm certainly by no means an expert or perfect at it, but I've come a long way, and it's made honestly dealing with life stressors so much easier when I can try and think of a different way to see the perspective and expanding my view. So I kind of think of it as in when I was growing up, and how that language that I learned from my experiences was like looking through a keyhole, right? So the keyhole is very narrow. I have a limited view of what I can see. But as I've learned to take different perspectives from different people, engage in curiosity and having grace with myself and my thoughts and my actions, and be forgiving, that keyhole now allowed, I unlocked it and opened the door. So now the view is much wider. And honestly, life is way more enjoyable when you take multiple perspectives. You're decreasing judgment with yourself and others. There's so much less stress. Holy moly, so much self-inflicted stress, right? Uh,
Yes.
it's insane to me how much worry and stress because of these thoughts that I'm having that have no basis in reality. And that's the other thing. Reality really is your perspective in the world. We might be looking at the same thing, but the realities could be quite starkly different depending on the person's experience and how they're interpreting an experience or whatever, an event. Fascinating stuff on resiliency, growth mind. Anyway, but yeah, I would say the hardest thing I've ever done is changing the mental chatter and discussions in my head, because it can lead you down some dark roads, and you have to be very, very careful.
This is so perfect because the example that you gave um, speaks to how we were raised. And so much of this also goes into our behavior around food now, right?
Right.
And it can be positive, which you had a very positive experience with pecans and this beautiful tree and I mean, this is like couldn't be more of a fairy tale, right?
Hmm.
Um, but it can also be the opposite for other people.
Yeah, I would say this, it is interesting, right? So, and everyone's going to have a different experience with food as they grow up. But for me, what was interesting, because we didn't have a lot of money, my mother really focused in on buying healthy foods because one, they were cheaper and they could stretch a dollar. We grew a lot of our own vegetables, and we had tons of beans and potatoes and all those things. And we had limited meat. We did have meat, but it was not like at every meal. um, we never went out to eat because it cost too much money. And so I learned I didn't have the ultra processed food addiction issues that I think, given the emotional state of the home, I could have easily, if those foods would have been available, I could have seen myself going down a very different path. But my environment didn't allow that. The only time that I got the more ultra processed foods was when I'd go stay with my grandmother for the summer, and she would buy these things because she thought it was showing love to buy soda and, oh my goodness, those cheesy Doritos and the Funyuns. The crunch and the salt. Oh my goodness. And, I didn't really like a lot of ice cream or stuff, but those things I knew I could enjoy at my grandmother's. But so that was, again, I think if I would have been in a stressful situation and had those foods and I know what those foods will do to you, because I remember sitting down with my grandmother and eating my weight in Doritos, understanding that enjoyment and that relief and dopamine hit could easily turn into something with maladaptive behaviors, but I didn't have that. So I found other ways to
compensate. And that was this destructive self-talk that I had about being unworthy and yada, yada, that so many people are struggle with, and much worse situations than I ever dealt with. But honestly, we all have our demons that we have to struggle with, but that self-talk piece is so important, and how we rationalize the destructive behaviors of either how we talk to ourselves, is it eating or doing drugs or whatever it is that we may find ourselves in. It's all goes back to this thing in our head. So important. But I turn it over to you because you are the professional in this area.
It does. And this is why, like, for people that are listening, when you think about how many times you've tried to make a health promoting change away from something that you've been doing that didn't promote health or worsened your health, and you have not met that goal, and maybe you've not met that goal over and over and over again, and you feel personally like a failure, this is why, right? Because we can't white knuckle our way through this until we actually understand why this behavior is happening. And then we challenge these thoughts. And where did these thoughts come from? Was it, from your childhood, or from stress relief, or trauma? And until we recognize that, like what we're doing in this example, and all the things that came up that cross so many people in their experience too, like you were saying with food, you had two stark examples there. And we've both seen in our practice, when parents are trying to change their diet for their kids to be more health promoting,
Right.
There's so much guilt, like, oh, they're being left out now, or, but they should have fun. And because food is marketed to us is to be fun and to celebrate. And, or if you had a bad day, like you name any emotion and food is sold that way.
Right.
You did good, great. You had a bad day, great. Like here, this is all just always being pushed in our face. And the thought of this gift you could give your children to be able to regulate their feelings and not self-soothe with food. Man, I would have loved that gift. For me, it was being introduced to dieting. It's second I hit middle school, it was like the era of, Jane Fonda and Slim Fast. Well, Jane Fonda's a little bit earlier.
I was going to say, you are not the Jane Fonda.
My mother had Jane Fonda tapes.
I think Jane Fonda was active when I was a kid, so you were definitely not.
I just had exposure through video.
Right, but you were exposed to it through, like, I grew up with the Beatles because my mom was a teenager in the 60s, right? So I love the Beatles, right? So these are things, exactly. You're exposed to it.
So my thoughts around food were always eat as little as possible because you want to be as small as possible. This whole thought of women trying to shrink themselves instead of being healthy and strong. So that was just one diet after another. But for all of you that have experienced dieting, what happens? It backfires every single time, which is why the diet industry is $1 billion industry, right?
Yeah. So I think, an interesting thing is when I think about meals at home, it was all like the food tasted fine, but it didn't have like I really want more because of the taste. Like I felt full. It was, so we'd put things in the refrigerator, we had leftovers the next day. So I was never pushed except for one time, which I won't go into, to consume something I didn't want. And it was, anyway, very unhelpful thing. But that piece of it was like when you were full, you were satisfied, you were done, and you put your food away in the refrigerator and ate it for leftovers the next day and utilized. So I never either was pushed either like for food scarcity in the sense of that. There were times we certainly wouldn't have had food if my grandmother wouldn't have brought us food. But there are pieces to that whole thing is just, I was learned to be satisfied with potatoes and beans. So
foods that we won't overconsume, right? Because they don't light up our addiction pathway.
Right, exactly. And
we've never overeaten, carrots, or in your case, we can't use blueberries, but
I could eat my weight in blueberries, but it's not like the pecan, right? It's that crunchy, higher fat. Something about the pecan. But anyway, so there's there's value in understanding. And kind of this, I wanted to share, the rabbit hole we were talking about that have been going down with this narrative psychology piece. And that book by James Pennebaker. And of course, I heard this on the Huberman Lab about the Pennebaker writing protocol. Then I started doing research, and I'm going to get this poor man doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to invite him to my podcast somehow. But he wrote a book called Opening Up by Writing It Down. I think this is really important because you spoke to it, and it kind of made me think about this, was, evaluating the emotions and the triggers and all that around here. But speaking to writing about something that troubles you and just writing it down for like 15 minutes, just creative, expressive writing. There's a little bit of a protocol. It's very simple to do. You guys check out the book or listen to the Huberman podcast recently about this, and seeing how understanding, because now what we've done is we're writing it out. It's our own truth. We're writing the facts as we remember it. We're writing our story. It's the emotions we felt then, the emotions we feel now. And then, if anything else bubbles up, writing about it. So then we're sitting down and we're putting pen to paper or fingers to the typing keyboard. That really is key, is because that allows us to see it in front of us. Like, oh, wow, I didn't think about that piece to it. And then over the course of the 4 days, like what they just prescribed, is you'll see a change from more negative discussion or words to a more positive. And that's where they think they see the well-being, peace and joy and mental health and even physiologic health, biologic health that can come out of this type of exercise. And I'm loving it. But anyway, yes, I think that investigation of the emotions that are attached to it are so important.
What's so funny about this is all rooted in mindfulness, right?
Yes.
And that's how we make change. It's not willpower, it's being mindful. And whatever way you end up doing that, like this exercise is fantastic. Sit down, very tactile, whether it was the computer or writing. And you get to see it after all of this stuff you poured out. I mean, that's an amazing mindful experiment.
And it's safe, right? So nobody else has to read this. It's just for yourself. You don't have to worry about judgments. You don't have to worry about anything. And you're just letting your free thought, free flow, let it go. And there's something about releasing the struggle out into the world. Yeah, it's just such an important piece. And that's that community aspect that you're speaking to, of having someone that you can go to that's a safe place, having a special person in your life. You just need one. If you have more than one, you're blessed. But yeah, the loneliness, all that, the community is really important.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a lot of good information. And so if we were to sum this up, it would be the story that you tell yourself that you can't control yourself around pecans. However, we know the end, that it's not true you do. And the way you do it is you bring them in once a year. But we went through the exercise, it'd be challenging this and then recognizing when would you lose control over pecans and why. We know they're high fatty food. We talked about in the previous podcast of what happens when we eat these very delicious foods and why our brain wants us to keep eating more. It's evolutionary. So this isn't you being a failure. And you have this rooted happy memory. So you have something else on top of that that's reinforcing of that. But you are very self-aware. You have done a lot of your own work. And something that you've done is your own self-talk, which is you have now this experience of having a negative behavior, the negative self-talk. You recognized it, you changed it. And now you said, I think that example of what you said, you were looking at this little keyhole and essentially you opened up the door by doing this. And did that happen overnight? No, none of this happens overnight. But your life is essentially changed, and that has crossed over into so many things by just looking at one maladaptive behavior, which all of us have negative self-talk. I mean, it's, do you remember that? Did you ever watch the show Mean Girls? Where the three girls were staring in the mirror and one was like, oh, my nose is too big. And the other one's like, oh, my hips. And one of the girls had never been exposed to that because she'd been raised in Africa with like animals and on safari. And she couldn't understand why these girls were saying it, but she wanted to fit in with her community. And she was like, She was trying to think of something to say bad about herself,
Mm.
because she hadn't been raised in that culture. So, identifying, challenging it, and then finding a different way. So your story is, I can eat these in moderation. So for me, I bring them in around the holidays, and that's when I enjoy them, and they become a very special treat to me.
No, absolutely. And I make it harder to order them. So this is not something I get off Amazon one click. I have in my head said the only place that I can order these are nuts.com. And I have to go on, I have to log into the site, I have to put in my address. So it's like it's way more energy than I'm willing to expend typically, because by the time that I would order it, I'm like, hey, Lori, you don't need these right now. It's not the holidays. Shut it down. So that also is, being mindful and creating some type of space to reflect and ask myself, is this really something I need to do right now?
Yeah, yeah. So you've set up barriers too, to
Mhm.
not to make the bad choice the hard choice, not the easy choice.
Yeah, I think that Amazon one click, that's the probably other thing is that I like to, it's like if somebody says you should do this, okay, let's try it. So I get things in here, so I'm like always like something shows up, they're like, my husband, one of his favorite things, like, now what did you order? I'm like, oh, there's a reason.
See, Amazon has done a very good job with this. Like, it makes it so
Oh,
easy. Oh,
oh
and I am a
man.
high utilizer.
Exactly. Oh, and AI is only going to make it worse, right? I can't even imagine. They probably will think a thought and it'll just show up on the doorstep. It's like,
Yeah, exactly. That'll be bad. That'll be bad for me.
exactly. Oi, oi,
Um,
oi. Mm,
so that's an example of cognitive behavioral therapy.
nice.
Um, and dialectical behavioral therapy is somewhat different. It teaches aspects of mindfulness, which is really good. And we kind of talked about why that can be really helpful, especially in this idea of when we become stressed, angry, lonely, tired, hungry, whatever that is, um, going to this behavior immediately that might not be good and dialing that back. Mindfulness is a great tool there, like doing breath work exercises. Think of square breathing or progressive body relaxation, downloading an app, anything to break that cycle. Again, being very mindful. And then like they focus on distress tolerance, because we all have stress in our lives and we have to address that. And that could be with people in our lives, our jobs, whatever that everybody has stress. So having a higher level of tolerance or being able to cope with that. So that's another therapy. But I think also, this idea of figuring out what's happening in your life and where this may be coming from is really important, because trauma, that is the one thing that I really wanted to address in terms of food addiction, because we see a high crossover here, with people that have experienced trauma, um, because this can be something that's self-soothing, or sadly, in the worst cases of sexual trauma, food is used as this protection. And what we see is people that have excess weight or obese, there's a very high prevalence of those that have experienced sexual trauma, and it's become a protective factor for them. So, this clearly, if you're experiencing this, please reach out to a professional to get help, and have community around you. So, this potentially could be group therapy if appropriate. And there are really good therapies to address trauma. And I'm sure for anybody experiencing this, this crosses over into other parts of your life. But just knowing that, like, where is this coming from, and being very honest with yourself, um, is really important in this space.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that if you are struggling with, we were just kind of thinking about something that's has a very minor consequence in my life, but of course people are dealing with much more substantial addictions and struggles, and we certainly don't want to downplay that. So absolutely reach out to someone to get the help that you need. But we wanted to kind of bring out an example just to make people start thinking about it. And if you are really struggling, yeah, absolutely look for help. There's a really great resource too. I love this book, The Body Keeps Score. I think that's such a really phenomenal understanding of kind of this speaks to the trauma and the sexual difficulties or traumas that people may have done, especially in youth. I think there was I can't remember what book I was listening to, but they were saying that under the age of 17, 22% of women had some type of sexual abuse occur in their life, and 10% of men before the age of 17. And so it's just overwhelming to think about that 1 in every 5 women that you see walking down the street have had some type of sexual trauma anyway. So that can have severely serious consequences mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, so many things. So absolutely reach out. Is there any particular area that you would say, or a hotline or anything that you can recommend for people?
Yeah, so right off the top of my head, 988 is now our new number if anybody's in crisis. So that's a crisis mental health. You'll be directed, one, if you're Spanish speaking, 2, if you're a veteran, and then 3, to a local community resource if that's not it. Very practical if you're employed, which most people are employed or have a spouse that's employed. Many companies have an EAP or some sort of mental health solution like a vendor to use. The reason why that's a great resource is because it's free and you can access it very quickly. And we know anybody with a mental health disorder, we get better. Like if you get better from mental health, just like we get better from other diseases, but it's getting treatment and getting it quickly, just like anything else. The sooner we address hypertension or diabetes. So sometimes there can be long waits. And so if you have something in place with a partner or a spouse, or yourself and your employer, look at that. Also, going through your insurance is another option. And then this would lead me into community. Community is such a great resource to tap into. So the Surgeon General has put out his it's not a proposal. I can't now think of the word. His report, yeah, on the epidemic of loneliness. Thank you. And this is a very real thing we're seeing right now. This was so interesting when I was reading some of the literature on this. So, like a couple of decades ago, if you did a survey across the United States and asked people how many close either friends or family could you reach out to if, like, let's say your car broke down and you need somebody to come pick you up, or your kid was sick at daycare and you couldn't leave work. These people like in a real big crisis you could reach out to. The average answer was about 2 to 3. They redid this survey recently, and the average number now is 0.
Oh,
which I thought was just shocking, and social psychologists or, people or researchers are trying to figure out, what's going on. And a lot of it we know is we're becoming more disconnected, the more hyper connected with devices we're becoming. Because if you think about it, you could live in your house and not see another soul. Like you could work remotely, you could order all your food to your house. We already talked about Amazon. If you can't order food, you can Amazon it. You could pay your light bill, your gas. Really, we've just become the society that if we wanted to, we could completely self-isolate. And I don't think that we wanted to, but, through the pandemic, we had to do that. And we just haven't seemed to move out of that so much. So we're seeing increased rates of depression, anxiety, and this plays in so much to what we're talking about with food addiction, because that's become a coping mechanism. The average weight gain during COVID was about 30 pounds per person. And so this is it just kind of is compounding on itself. So getting into community, for whatever reason that is, when we're looking at underlying reasons why we might cope with food and have developed a bad habit with that, or a maladaptive habit, is fantastic. Because why? Well, you get to see you're not alone. This can feel like nobody else struggles with this except for me. or nobody has it as bad as I do, but that's 100% not true. So in a community, you see other people that are struggling as well, or other people that have been where you've been and have gotten better. Or if there's something that you really are trying to problem solve, there are other people there to help you with that. Accountability is fantastic. Just kind of like this idea, if you sign up for a fitness class with somebody else, it's not, when you know somebody's counting on you, you're more likely to go. So community is just like one benefit after another. And if we're thinking specifically about community around food addiction, there's Overeaters Anonymous. So there is a structured community for this. And this is a place that is safe, it's instructor led. There are guidelines around it, so safety for those that come there. And it's built on the AA 12 step. So there is this thought of a higher power, that it's not just us. And that can be whatever you are, even if you don't have a spirituality practice. This is just this essential, it could be universal. But it's a fellowship, and it's a common desire to discontinue over compulsive eating, and have a healthier relationship with food.
No, I think that's great. Those are some phenomenal resources. 98, all of that you're discussing. I think, yeah, that community piece is really important. So, latching on to someone, and if you're isolated remotely, online groups to start with, and then, trying to find meetup groups or other places that, connecting with people who have same interests is really, really important. So, well, fantastic. Well, I know we've gone quite a while, so we will thank you, Catherine, for sharing your expertise and having some real fun, interesting deep dives into my mental health. And so I appreciate that. And we're excited to see your journey into this space and seeing what we're going to be offering soon. And thank you again for sharing with us today.
Thanks for having me.